regardless of which future we're in, the role of advertisers, not just advertising to humans and to agents as decision makers, and increasingly figuring out how to market to agents in the way that agents need to be communicated with in order to make the best decisions, but also to prompt brand preference, create brand preference with human audiences that shape the way that humans interact with their agents is key. It's going to be absolutely essential for brands to be top of mind for humans as they craft the prompts and routines and instructions for their agent representatives.
Hello, and welcome to a special edition of the WPP Media Intelligence Podcast. We're going to do a summer mini-series of episodes where we look ahead to 4 plausible but contrasting future worlds. We'll examine each possible future not as a prediction, but as a way of backcasting to understand how the current state of media, technology, and commerce might evolve based on a series of potential developments. We'll talk through what each future scenario might mean for agencies and advertisers, and then with 3 concrete actions leaders can take today to improve their company's chances of resilience and success. Joining me to dive into the current and future state of AI, corporate strategy, and geopolitical uncertainty is my friend and colleague, Sam Weston, WPP Media's head of industry communications. Welcome to the pod.
I made it. It's been a long time coming, Kate. I don't know what took you so long. Maybe it was my deep inherent shyness and terror of being put in exactly this situation. But as a one-time producer, long-time fan, eternal friend, happy to be here with you today.
I was going to say, it's not for lack of trying to get you on the pod, Sam.
I don't know. I was cursed with this foundational experience earlier in my career where I worked at a PR agency where the one rule on the wall was that PR people really should never be seen and never heard. Never. We should always be in the background.
You're at the children's table. You've graduated from the children's table, Sam.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I've stumbled into a world now where everyone has to be famous all the time.
I've said before that if I didn't have to be a creator, I wouldn't. And here we are. And we're going to have fun. I know you wanted to take today's episode to just hash over the recent Odyssey movie, but I haven't seen it yet, so we can't do that.
Just because there are no tickets, or because you have other priorities?
Mostly the latter, really.
I think it's unfortunate that our resident archer has not been yet to see summer's biggest archery movie.
I will say it for that reason. I'm slightly, as a reader of the full text of the Odyssey, yes, because I am.
You're going to tell me you're a Wilson devotee and her review threw you off?
Yeah, I read a couple of reviews where I was like, I don't know if this captures, like, he's not some haunted, penitent guy. He's like a trickster and a kind of a jerk sometimes. And so, I don't know. Anyway, we can rehash it.
We'll do this next week when you're finally, done your duty.
All right, so let's get into what we're actually here to discuss, which is not trying to predict 2035, but you and we're constantly talking about AI in the future, and so we've laid out sort of 4 potential futures, and we're going to test those 1 per week over 4 weeks, looking at the evidence we have today of where things are headed, and also then what would have to be true to mean that we get to any one of these futures versus another one. In each world, artificial intelligence becomes important, obviously, but power settles somewhere different, right? Either with platforms, individuals, the state, or sort of the existing plural power market. And so the question is not whether any one scenario arrives intact, but again, what would have to happen to bring them to life? And so you created sort of a nice 2x2 as a strategy professional. I love a good 2x2. So talk us through the axes through which we should be thinking about these four worlds, and then we'll introduce the first one.
Well, I mean, first of all, funny that the future that we predicted so long ago is our present reality, and that we're living through it. So, this is a continual effort that we've had to imagine where we're going, and it's been crazy to see how fast we actually got to the future that we predicted when we started doing this, 10 years ago, what feels
Yeah,
like.
you're referencing our advertising in 2030 report that we published in 2020, and looks very prescient nowadays, really.
Yeah, I mean, funny, and thinking about a 2035 timeline is similar, right, to going back to 2020. And you've been doing a great job for many years, thinking about the tensions in our current ecosystem, and lots of this is really inspired by the potential paths that you've already mapped out. But as we think about the big debates and fault lines in AI at the moment, I think they exist on these axes of control versus openness. So right now, one of the big debates is, are we going to live in a controlled system where either companies control AI access and deployment, or governments do?
Exactly. And I think the control element is one side. And then if we kind of plot that against another axis that looks at how distributed versus concentrated that control is. And so that's kind of the 2x2 we're talking about here.
Right. So yeah, right. So we're really looking at a control versus distribution axis.
Exactly. So that's our starting point. We're going to dig into the first of these potential sort of worlds today, one we're calling the closed loop. We'll play with these titles as we go. But this future suggests a world where corporations are preeminent in terms of determining the shape of commerce, media, technology, life, and business, really across all these different kind of
This is
customers.
your snow crash scenario where we all live in one of several corporate end-to-end monopolies.
It is a little bit. It is. We're going to talk about Mr. Lee's Greater Hong Kong and Casa Nostra Pista here. So yeah, this is kind of the world where AI becomes abundant and highly autonomous. We're going to talk a lot about agents, but there is more concentrated coordination, and a lot of that sits, again, at a corporate level versus government or distributed amongst the broad populace. So that kind of sets the stage for what we're talking about. So let's imagine for our listeners this 2035 world. And again, this is purely a theoretical exercise. Listeners, this is not to us saying this is absolutely what's going to happen. But a good thinking exercise, scenario wargaming sort of idea. So it's 2035. Governments still exist. Markets are nominally competitive, but a small number of platform ecosystems have basically won the practical contest for everyday digital life, right? Each combines some version of personal AI, identity, communications, entertainment, work, payments, shopping, logistics, health, education, security, and customer service. That's a big list, right? That these corporations are all trying to tie together. Consumers don't simply use these platforms, they kind of are members of them in a larger sense. And so a persistent assistant, that's fun to say over and over again, digital assistants understand the user's household, calendar, relationships, all of these things, and can bring that intelligence together to make recommendations, negotiate purchases, handle returns and renewals. And that assistant appears to work for the consumer, but definitely operates in a commercial ecosystem that is, we want to say, like managed or controlled by a major platform. That agent or platform might have preferred merchants, integrated services, default payment systems, all of these things that come alongside that being, again, vertically integrated and held within a sort of a single platform or company world. But convenience has really become sort of a form of private governance. People are willing to opt into this because it's easy and it might be cheaper than trying to bundle all this stuff together yourself. How does that sound? Does that sound like a world where you want to live,
Hey,
Sam?
give me convenience. I'd probably give my life over to one of the platforms already if I could actually just, easily substitute everybody else out. But I can definitely see that being a potential future.
There are a couple of things that I think aren't true now, right? That is the gap between where we are today and that. Agents are not as reliable, right? They can't do as much. They still need all these harnesses and often people with coding experience working in terminals to really get the most out of them. So that's something that we would need to, see evolve to get to this future world. Consumers are going to have to accept this value exchange of handing over their data and, again, to some extent, to make it the most personalized. Maybe that's health information from trackers, sensors in the home. All of these things are going to require very, very high levels of trust in order to get that exchange for convenience, protection, personalization. We can talk about some of the things that might drive that as we go backcasting for what we expect in each year. I think there are some good elements that point to why that might actually happen. And this is so interesting based on the kind of debate today between open source models and closed source models. This is a world where closed platform agents really have to consistently outperform open source models. Right. There has to be something that makes it worthwhile opting into this more closed ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have thoughts?
Well, we already sort of have our various ecosystems. You're either a green dot or a blue dot, right?
How dare you reduce me to a color?
And so in many ways, we're already part of sort of consolidated ecosystems. We're not forced to think about it. And I think our regulatory system, especially in the US, but I'm sure in other countries as well, I think has prevented platform brands and brands from really leaning into that, either as a disclosed or really even an ambition. But you could imagine ways in which the AI race and capability development would accelerate or just make it easier for that path to become easier for people without even really thinking about it, right?
Yeah, I think some of this, that the speed of innovation here is important, right? If platforms are using AI to evolve much, much faster than, say, governments can evolve to write controls, then I think we get more likely to this situation.
I think that's quite a prominent conversation in AI and policymaking circles right now. Dario recently published a whole point of view on the gap, basically, on how fast capabilities are evolving versus how fast policymakers are able to keep up or even appreciate. And so there's a lot of effort being made right now to close the gap between DC and AI. And I think some really encouraging collective action across these competing companies. So, just this week there's no shortage of petitions, but there was an interesting petition that's been sort of signed by people from across all the major labs about surfacing the idea that we might need to not slow or pause, but pace capability release. I think, I don't know, I could definitely see this path happening, especially if AI capabilities accelerate faster than we're prepared for. And I think if companies are prepared to distribute this sort of hardware and the equipment necessary to capture users and keep them in their system.
Yeah. Well, so users is one side. But the other thing, because we are speaking especially to our clients and brand advertisers, we're going to dig really deeply into their point of view through all of this. So for brands and merchants, I think in this world, in order to have this come to light, those parties really would have to accept sort of platform dependency across a number of closed large platforms, because the immediate sort of conversion performance is too valuable to resist. So there just isn't really a good scenario where you're trying to maintain a lot of your own sort of autonomy in this space, in this world. You're basically signing up to reach these platforms, users who have aligned with those platforms as a brand or as a retailer, and you may even align more closely with one than another.
Yeah, I think that resembles the way that we operate already. as advertisers, right? Or as, facilitators of advertising. We already live in a world that is very much platform centric. And it's interesting to speculate about how power dynamics might shift, but in many ways, it would be just a continuation of the approach that we've been grappling with, and I think benefiting from and creating mutual value, out
Yeah.
of many years now.
Yeah, I'll bring in we're going to bring in, because it is earnings season, but instead of we're just repeating rote growth numbers to you this week and the next couple of weeks, we're just going to bring in sentiments that we're hearing from earnings and as they apply to these scenarios. So a couple of things. One, I think from both Google's and Microsoft's earnings calls last week and this week, just the sheer sort of numbers and percentages of top 500, top 1,000 companies that are on these platforms using their cybersecurity AI tools. There is already such adoption within these platforms, and some companies probably, again, are utilizing services from multiple companies, right? I mean, they're a client of both Google and Microsoft and maybe Amazon for other services, but there is high adoption into these platforms already. I think you're right. One of the other things I constantly look at when we're viewing, for instance, CPG earnings, many of them will report, the concentration of their sales that come from large platforms already, like Walmart or Amazon. So there are these elements where brands are already making that call: is the sales payoff high enough that I'm willing to accept concentration in this case? So I agree that those are already conversations and decisions that the brands are being forced to make today.
In the spirit of events from this week, I don't know if you read Mark Zuckerberg's op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, but it's very he's not alone as a CEO or as a leader of a significant company calling for open approaches to AI development. And it's just interesting to sort of imagine this scenario in the context of how people are talking about the current moment in terms of open versus closed development paths.
Yeah. The cynical view there is that that's because the benchmarks for Llama and Meta's AI tools are
Keep them
not
open
at the same
till we
level.
catch up.
but
Yeah.
but that's the cynical view. We're not. I don't run
No,
those
it's not.
standards myself. So, all right. So let's ask a sort of existential question in this new world for brands, right? What happens when brands maybe no longer reach customers directly, but they're sort of earning access through a platform-controlled agent? So have that in mind as we sort of talk through what advertising might look like in this future world. We're thinking, because of the integration of AI and agents into this platform world, much of that traditional purchase journey might collapse. And this is something that we've explored on the podcast before. So there's a need, whether that is voiced by a human or just sort of intuited or sensed by technology and AI based on routine or whatever else, that need might just go directly to an assistant, go directly to a recommendation, go through payment, fulfillment, repeat purchase. Maybe if that becomes a subscription, that makes it even easier to do. So there might not be a lot of categories where customers are browsing a long list of options. Their agents might make a decision based on price, availability, brand preference, ideally, right? That still has importance in this world. And so let's talk through especially that sort of how decisions get made, and what the value of a brand is in this potential future world where more and more is agent mediated and maybe even aligned with some of these, external considerations around delivery, logistics, preference, alignment with platform, that kind of thing.
I mean, I think in multiple scenarios, we would expect agents to play an increasingly significant intermediary role in all of the decision making. And it's interesting to imagine why people would commit to specific, platform ecosystems over another, right? If you're going with Amazon, it's for maybe it's for the strength in the household planning, and delivery. Maybe Meta's ecosystem gives you more exposure, and your agent more exposure to cultural trends and stuff from your social network. Whereas, you know, Google is perhaps access to information, or it's the strength of its Gemini model over and above language, for example. So I think that one, in just choosing which platform you want to have run your life, run your household, the brands and the capabilities, I think, will probably play a key role. And then it's interesting for brands to think about how they show up in each of those contexts. I think, regardless of which future we're in, the role of advertisers, not just advertising to humans and to agents as decision makers, and increasingly figuring out how to market to agents in the way that agents need to be communicated with in order to make the best decisions, but also to prompt brand preference, create brand preference with human audiences that shape the way that humans interact with their agents is key. It's going to be absolutely essential for brands to be top of mind for humans as they craft the prompts and routines and instructions for their agent representatives.
Yeah, I mean, there's a piece of, because humans are known to make quite emotional decisions. I think there's sometimes been an element of, brands value signaling, and whether that was actually a part of the decision making or not, who knows? But that if those kinds of values are coded into the instructions for a digital assistant or household buying agent, that codifies it in a much more rigorous way, right? And that it then becomes important and more valuable for the brands that have kind of had these long-lasting values that they've been investing in, and maybe not always sure whether it made all that much difference. But I think that starts to pay off going forward, because you have the expert saying that your beauty brand is actually better, or your battery actually lasts longer, or these things are going to be picked up by LLMs, and then I think they're going to translate into people's preferences, and maybe not get waylaid by just, I don't know, pretty packaging at the store. Pretty packaging at the store will still matter for some things. But
media planning becomes really important, because identifying the different opportunities to create strategic advantage for your brand is going to be massively important, right? Like, when does somebody make a decision? When do the sort of preferences get set? And then a big part of marketing becomes the human version of prompt injection. Right? How can you, as a marketer, find a way to catalyze a particular preference or instruction from a human audience to their agent representative?
yes, I've been saying this for years. It makes such a difference. Will make such a difference, I believe, if you can have a human say, buy me this brand of toothpaste, versus just, oh, I'm out of toothpaste. Can you order me some more?
Yeah. And in a world where you're very platform centric, setup, figuring out how to negotiate the specific environments is going to be massively important for brands, and probably create a role for agencies to play, because each platform will have its own set of custom instructions for how its tools, its agents respond to those kinds of instructions, right? So, like, if the platform has its own generic alternative, is
Sure.
the agent challenging the decision, or persistently offering up a decision to choose the platform brand.
Yeah.
So I think this is a new kind of potential battleground
I just want to point out at this point, we have talked about some of the US-based companies and platforms, but really, there are already platforms that are maybe further along on this path in other parts of the world. Tencent comes to mind, obviously, as sort of the closest to a super app that exists today, where you have things like WeChat Pay, government services, right? This is basically what we're talking about, companies sort of offering things that maybe historically would have been provided at a municipal or state or federal level. That kind of example already exists. We just haven't seen it in other regions like the US or Europe because there's been a anti-competitive sort of pushback on allowing these things to get too big and too integrated. I think there's a real possibility that as these companies expand into other markets, maybe as they expand their sales of clean energy, I mean, like China, especially as a region, clean energy, EVs, data centers, commerce, autos, AI services, digital assistants, if those are cheaper and widely available in these markets, I think there is a world where consumers or markets, countries sort of just opt to say, well, we're going to align, not necessarily on ideology or historical alliances with markets. We're just going to align on what's cheap and easy for us. And in some cases, that may align more closely to some of these platforms that are China-based instead of US-based. We're not saying that this sort of future, well, again, who knows what will happen. But I think as we talk about platforms and sort of platforms holding a key role, the important thing is to understand that that includes platforms like Xiaomi and Tencent, ByteDance, those kinds of companies that are building similar things right now.
Yeah, really interesting point. I think one of the most interesting dynamics right now is where does power sit between governments and platforms? Already you have this emergence of platform companies being national champions, right? And in our existing current reality, you have in China government-affiliated companies that are perceived and operate that way. And in the context of the AI conversation in the US and the UK and European countries, there's a real need or drive to codify. And I think the the state orientation of some of these platforms. And one of the defining contingencies will be where power ultimately sits. Do governments delegate more control to the platforms that are their national champions versus take it for themselves? And that'll be the alternative. Will be the scenario will be the one we explore in the future, where there's much more government control over.
Yes, yeah. So stay tuned for that in another week. You mentioned national champions. It's a great time to bring up an article I was reading a couple of weeks ago about Lidl owner Schwartz Group and how they're pushing into AI and tech cloud systems. They're kind of taking that same model of an Amazon or an Alibaba and building it very cognizantly with that idea that we need a homegrown European solution like this. Okay, good. Interesting. Let's talk through sort of a very brief sequence of events. Like what is going to happen? What should we be watching for over the next several years that would indicate this is the future we're headed for? So we're going to talk through a few of these. I think first and foremost, agents really and assistants have to step by step gain trust and perform more and more autonomously across more and more tasks, right? And then they gain more trust. And then, so we're going to have to see that step ladder of agents becoming really so important to utilities, so, necessary for consumers in their day-to-day lives that they're, again, willing to hand over more and more tasks, more and more data in order to enable that flywheel.
Yeah, I mean, huge amounts of resources are going into making that possible right now. And there's certainly this adoption on the frontier, people who are actively using AI. But as we know, the gap between what happens on the frontier and mass audiences is quite significant. And while it might be easy for, engineers in San Francisco to figure out how to use OpenClaw to connect your email and your systems. Most people are not that savvy, actually, when it comes to engineering their own tech setups.
I did see. So looking through the mail yesterday, and we get this pamphlet from the local community college, and they have continuing education classes, mostly I think for retired adults, and they now have classes on AI, and they have they have like a general AI beginners course, and then they have courses specifically for ChatGPT and Gemini, like help you get the most out of these new tools. So it's expanding.
Yeah, I mean, things are changing quickly. I mean, we were wondering when agents were really going to show up, and I think agents are here. Of course, there's always the challenge of defining exactly what an agent is, because people use that term quite loosely. But systems that are able to make decisions on your behalf, and I think there's a lot of effort going into trying to make those things plug and play for consumers.
Yeah.
So
All right. So I think the convenience bargain that has to really be in place by, say, 2028, maybe bleeding into 2030, where platforms are bundling personal AI with things like fraud protection, which is, as more people use AI, it's going to be good actors and bad actors. I think that's going to be another driver. We spoke about this, of what pushes people to trust digital assistants more and more, is just the onslaught of potential spam or phishing or fraud aimed at them, that they're going to need their own sort of intermediary in that case. So identity, payments, all of these things that platforms could potentially make more seamless, that'll be in place sort of 2028 to 2030. The next step then, I think, is really more autonomy for agents in terms of agentic commerce, closing the funnel, and especially within these platforms. So replenishment booking, comparison switching, and across, I think, a broader array of types of purchases, not just small things that it doesn't matter if they get it wrong, but my next retirement investment vehicle, or the big decisions, big choices that really require a lot of intelligence and trust in that space.
yeah, I think that's right. You would go from a platform where people are actively using agents, perhaps across multiple platforms, to them becoming a core part of the way people interact in the world, making decisions, and then that builds into a place where people just want the system that offers them the most convenience across all of their data, home interfaces, their life.
And optimization becomes possible, right? If it knows that you're saving for this retirement vacation, then it can suggest an option for whatever that is aligned to that, right? Which wouldn't be possible, again, if you were straddling multiple different platforms or multiple different services or that kind of thing. All right. So then what happens next? I think what keeps people in these ecosystems? I think partly it's whether if governments haven't mandated portability, and we're going to get into that much more in another episode, I think that helps, right? Because it's harder to then switch. But there might be something about membership that is very, very attractive. So whether that's prices, the kinds of services that get bundled for free, reputation, protections, access, right? These are things that we know have made a difference in past business models, this kind of membership idea. I was just listening to the Acquired podcast on Costco.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, they talk a lot about membership and what it means, and the intrinsic sort of things that it brings about, like less shrinkage. People are less likely to steal from the store because they're members and they're all in it together. I think there are things like access when you look at credit card companies and the kinds of experiential things they put on, say, at the US Open or sporting events. So I think all of these are likely to be used by platforms to encourage membership and loyalty, right? And that will be important to keeping people in these ecosystems, most likely.
CRM supremacy. It's the ultimate the ultimate realization of the challenge that brands are currently grappling with, of how do you just create enough value to outweigh churn. And actually, you could imagine that in a world with increased intelligence and access to people's data, that's easier and easier to achieve.
Do you think brands play a part in that? Are there like special formulations of things or versions of services that they create that are unique to each platform? Like this is a platform A version of our product or service, and this is
Yeah,
because they know that certain either consumers align with a certain platform or I don't know, right? Like it.
brands already have some familiarity with this. You have your brand store on Amazon. You go through the approvals process to get your app on, iOS, and in that future, brands have a version of themselves that's oriented toward existing in that specific ecosystem with those users.
Okay. So that takes us through sort of what 2032 to 2033, right? We're getting more utility. 2034 to 2035, this is sort of the pinnacle. Like we're now reaching really the state that we sort of painted the picture of in the beginning. This is potentially a world where platforms are no longer merely hosting commercial activity, but they're determining the architecture through which people are sort of experiencing the world and making choices. So we'll see. Again, this is nearly 10 years out. It's nearly impossible to predict well that far into the future when things are moving this quickly, which is why, and part of this is inspired a little bit from a podcast I know we both listened to, Dorkesh, where he had economists Alex Simas and Phil Tremel, I think, and they were talking about this backcasting, right, as a means of trying to get to understanding potential futures, because just, plotting it out forwards is
Yeah.
it's nigh on impossible.
But I think having gone through this exercise, this is a totally foreseeable future, but it would require um, trade-offs that we haven't been prepared to make in the past, both in terms of what consumers are willing to accept, but more importantly, I think what governments are willing to accept in terms of consolidation.
Yeah.
But AI is going to create a whole bunch of exceptional circumstances, and I think it'd be very easy to see this path being something that we fall into and that people are broadly okay with, as long as they do have the ability to move ecosystems if they want.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think Europe has been the most strident in its opposition to this kind of consolidation and concentration. Arguably, as we said, this model is probably closest to already existing in China, although that also is an area where you can't really see government ceding any kind of control. And then you have the US kind of in the middle with on and off attempts at anti-competitive and antitrust and back and forth descriptions of what would trigger those kinds of scrutiny or investigations, whether it is more closely aligned to just consumer harm, right? Where if you're imagining a bundled sort of platform situation where outside of that, inflation has continued and things are really expensive and hard to do. But inside this platform world where we subsidize a lot of services and products for you because you're part of our membership group, right? Might be quite hard to make the consumer harm argument in that case. And unless you draw it again, like on switching costs or portability or things like that. But it does make it easier to see how an administration, potentially like the US, would allow for that maybe more easily.
Yeah, I think one of the big questions is, does this kind of future allow new platforms to be created and exist and compete? I mean, similar dynamics to the ones that we've been living through, just different context. That would be very interesting to see play out. I think platforms would have the ability with AI to probably model and build their own capabilities quite quickly. So much more of a sort of meta approach to cloning capabilities than acquiring them.
Yeah. How important is scale? How easy is it to amass scale, especially if you need the opt-in and behavior of multiple consumers to make your products and services that much better. There are probably a few plug-and-play ones that work for the majority of people, and then there are maybe these more startup niche ones that have a specific we're the like uber green circular economy, everything on our platform is, resold or whatever, or one that's really specifically for digital nomads, right? So that they can be anywhere and they don't have to be tied to. You could imagine all these different niche ones starting up, certainly, but probably not managing to accumulate a majority of consumers worldwide.
I think in this future, brands have to conceive of themselves as value adds for each of the platforms and focus on doing their prompt injections for audiences in order to stay top of mind.
All right, well, so let's finish on that. For our brands and advertiser listeners, we're going to finish each of these potential future worlds with the same sort of closing segment. So this is 3 moves for 2026. We're going to cover one big strategic bet that they could be making today to help with resilience if this is the future world. One risk to map. What would be detrimental sort of if it came about, and so what can you do to mitigate against that? And then one signal to watch that might suggest we're now more likely to head towards this future. So we'll start with one strategic bet. Like, what are we saying would be good for brands to think about or take on today?
Well, I think lots of brands are already down this line through essentially AEO, or the sort of evolved version of SEO. Everyone's thinking about how to make their brand discoverable to agents, but I think really leaning into operationalizing your company and your marketing for a world in which agents are the primary audience, or as primary as humans, is got to be bet number one.
Yeah, I think all the pieces that come around that to PR services, experiential pieces that help with consumer reviews, and everything that touches what is eventually going to inform agents for sure. All right, one risk to map. Here, I think we're looking at what dependencies already exist. So we mentioned that as a part of financial disclosures, brands already sort of have to disclose where they have particular concentrations of their sales with a particular platform. Going through that process as it relates to marketing and advertising services, I think is also a good exercise to do now, understanding where those reliances or dependencies exist across the demand, identity, measurement, transactions, customer access. Where do brands have their own contacts with consumers versus where is it intermediated, and understanding how they'd like to develop that in the future.
Be making some bets. I mean, either you want to continue to put bets on specific platforms, or perhaps diversify, but just making that very considered and intentional.
Yep. All right. And one signal to watch, or maybe we'll each do a signal to watch that would suggest, this is maybe more likely than we even thought today.
Well, I think the big thing here is actually capability. If we're on a fast trajectory, not just in terms of capability, actually, but adoption, that's going to create some advantages for platforms that already have user bases and can become trusted providers of intelligence to consumers.
So here you're talking about intelligence and AI and agent capabilities primarily. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's probably right. I'd say another one here is what happens with the regulatory environment and whether the nascent AI regulations and proclamations in various markets, how much teeth those have, how enforced they are, and the rollout to, markets beyond sort of the big ones that we talk about, US, Europe, China, what happens in Nigeria and Brazil, in markets with big populations. What kind of model are they aligning themselves to or following at this stage? All right. Episode 1 done. Next time, Well, as a quick reminder, the WPP Media Intelligence podcast is meant for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered financial advice, especially when we're talking about 2035. Next week, we are going to tackle episode 2, which we are calling the Agent Commons. So this is more so everyone has an agent. No one owns the market. It's a much more fragmented and diversified way of thinking about how intelligence functions and where it sits. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks for having me.